Thank you for listening so well today, by the way. Are teenagers in here? Yes? Okay. I'll be in my best behavior, Pastor. Okay, so I want to talk about families. How many of you know Juanita Purcells? She used to be a very popular speaker back in the day. I've never had the privilege to meet her. Her husband pastors. And so they write, and they're evidently, pretty funny people. I wish I could have met them because I thought it was humorous when they both speak, and one Saturday morning, and my wife and I speak. My wife actually is a better speaker than I am. She's not a better preacher, but sometimes she gets pretty good at it. And so, so Juanita was speaking on that Saturday morning. Her husband was home changing the oil, and on the way out, she couldn't get her zipper back here, and she was kind of running behind, as most people do. And so she said, "Honey, can you help me with this?" And so he was goofing around and, went like zip, 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 and it busted the zipper. Have you heard this? Because the last time I said this, you shook your head like you heard the other joke. So I was just making sure you hadn't heard this one. I guess one you haven't heard. So she has to get another one on, blah, 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 and she leaves. And so around lunchtime, she gets home, and she drives up the car and pulls in the driveway, and the car is there, and she sees her husband under the car, with his legs sticking out, and she went over and grabbed his fly and went zip, 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 and went into the kitchen where he's sitting there. And told him, "Honey, what? No, I saw you out. You said you're going to change the car oil." And he starts laughing. He said, "Honey, I couldn't get the filter. And so I asked our neighbor next door to come over and help me." And so they both race out, and the legs are still just like nothing changed. And he grabs his neighbor's ankles and pulls him out, and he has a big giant goose egg right here and knocked himself out. This is the truth. I'm just telling you. So sometimes things happen that you just, don't expect. All right. And we have till what time here? 11:45, correcto? I promise I'll be on time. All right. So let me go back to what I mentioned at service here. So this is the second of 4 messages that are all stacked in about the idea of a family. You have a family story to tell. Some of this was stimulated about a week ago. I was sitting there at a nice, cool Iowa morning, the fire going and snow on the ground. And my mother is a very detailed person. And so she had given to us, I have 2 older brothers I told you about, a notebook, a family book. And she had documented her side of the family, and actually my dad's side of the family, particularly hers, about her grandparents. Didn't have much about the great-grandparents, but grandparents, her parents, them, their life, how they met. They met at Biola College. She's from Oregon, met my dad, grew up in Hollywood and Vine. My grandfather worked for the Hollywood industry, electrician, lighting guy. And they met at Biola in the late 70s, met after 2 years. And they never had a chance to finish because a boy came along, another boy, and then myself. So they document all this. And I was looking at it and thinking, some discoveries that, like my great-grandfather, her grandfather, was a Rusconi, Italian, okay? And I'm a pretty even guy. I'm just like a vanilla guy. So I claim that as I got Italian in me, okay? So my wife laughs at that, but nonetheless. And then my other side, her other father was a part of a grocery store in Kansas City, and they made, it was pretty fascinating how, all that. Some of you have been on Ancestry.com. How many of you have Ancestry.com? Okay. It kind of, I guess, tells you about Mormons run it, I think. Mormons run all that business. But the value of your story and your narrative, okay, I think is important. The older you get and become Q-tips, living out here, if you don't know what that is, look that up later after I'm done. And so that's white-haired people, okay? So all of that to be said, there's a narrative here. And your children, your grandchildren will learn from that. So the meta-narrative of the Bible all leads to the culmination of what you read about in Matthew, documents who Jesus Christ was. But these stories were given for our admonition. So I want to look at today a story when you're helping people with, today we talked about what you're wrestling with, intrusions in your life. But there are occasions where you have like major catastrophes. And it's not just an intrusion, it's something that's going to alter your life forever. It becomes a narrative for you, okay? And there's a lot of people that you know. And so I'm kind of wanting to, if this is okay, Pastor, to make it a little more teaching oriented, like how do you help somebody that's going through difficulties, family difficulties? Now, I think counseling is listening to a person till a Bible parallel comes to mind. I'm generalizing, okay? So good counseling is listening to a person till a Bible parallel comes to mind. And I would suggest to you, if you yourself are of some kind of major disaster or catastrophe, that there is references to those kind of events. And this would be one I would suggest that you use, okay? So I want to walk through this with you, and I just want to kind of make it as a teaching element, because I'm finding that today for our families, we have major press to speed up activities. And it's really hard to slow down. It's really hard to stop and focus. That's why I'm a fan of churches like this that cause you to pause and think about these things. Tonight I'm going to talk about, I do believe in the New Testament, so I'm going to use that tonight. And I'm so glad Pastor is focusing in on technology next week, because that is only accelerating what I'm talking about. It's hard for people to be patient. We drove over to Sedona yesterday. Beautiful place. We're coming back, and you can drive 75 miles an hour out here. I'm sure you know that. It's awesome. I have police friends that tell me you can go 80. And I go 80. And tell my wife last night, it's dark. Honey, slow down. I'd slow down on 75. And she's still feeling it's just right there, and it's okay. And I slowed down. I was going below the speed limit. Amazing. And people are whipping by me. Like, where's everybody going? Back to Phoenix or what? It was wild. That's what happens to so you have your kids, your grandkids. Everything is sped up, because this is going to solve everybody's problem right here. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I won't take away any of your thunder, I promise you, but there is another generation that are called the epic generation. I'm going to comment on that tonight. So I'm saying this because I want to give you a tool in your hand. This is so simple, I'm embarrassed to give you this outline, but a guy named John Phillips, 20 years ago, I heard this outline, it just stuck with me. Because you need to draw people back beyond your story to something Bible. And even unsafe people know about Job. What do you know about Job? Okay, let's just take a minute, talk to me here. What do you know about Job? Speak up really loud so I can hear you. He's a good guy. Is that what you said? He's a good guy? He's a good guy. It is Job. I led a guy to the Lord years ago, and he was filtering through the Bible. I said, whatever questions you got, every week we'll meet. And then I had other things I was going through with him. He said, man, I've been reading that book of Job. Amazing. Job, that guy Job, he's something. You ever not have a heart that's actually, and it was Job from then on, so it's okay. What else you know about him? Good. Never lost a what? Oh, faith. I'm sorry. I thought you said trials. Okay. Okay. Let's talk about details. Where is this narrative? It's a poetic book, right? Psalms, before Psalms, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. We know he's somewhere lived, depending on how you want to look at the story, around 60 is when he goes through this major event, about 6 months. Then he lives somewhere, depending on how you want to interpret the last of that book, up to 140 and he died, or another 140 years. I've read all kinds of stuff. But so if he's living somewhere about 140 to 200, he's actually, they say, before Abraham. It's somewhere in Abraham, okay, in that time frame. So he's like a couple thousand years before ever the time of Christ. It's the oldest book, actually, that we still have in existence. That's documented, the oldest book, okay? And he's the smartest, the wealthiest, the most known guy, right? I'm telling you things you know. I mean, this is the guy. You want to meet the smartest guy, smartest businessman? Go see that guy. The healthiest guy? Go see him. The godliest guy? Same guy. That's Job. Do you remember that, right? How many kids did he have? I'm kind of brushing off history here. 10? How many boys? How many girls? 7 boys? 3 girls? Amazing. And then he hits this major issue. Disaster strikes. And the rest of the book is about his dialogue, okay? So let me give you the best outline I can give to you. It's not mine. Part of it's not mine. And then start with that. I want to build on one of those 3 points and then draw some conclusions at the end. And I can do this in the time frame, okay? If you think about the book of Job, this is how you break it up. That God loved Job enough, number 1, to put him in the hand of Satan. Chapter 1 and 2. Chapter 3 through about 41, God put him into the hands of men. And then he finally put him in his own hand, in the hand of God. So in other words, he put him in the hand of Satan, and it was a crisis. There was a catastrophe. Then he put him in the hands of men, and he was criticized. And then he put him in his very hand, the hand of God. And that's where you find him with a deeper conviction. How does God work in all of our lives? How does he move us from a concept of God to a very concrete, personal knowledge of God? Job said it in Job 42:5. What does the verse say? Yeah, I heard thee, and my eyes sees you. And I'm telling you, that concept is exactly what he still does today. Now, the reason why it's in that back in the Old Testament, because the Jews had this whole thinking, if basically you keep living good and God's going to bless you. And it was not in their paradigm that if something bad was happening, it's actually because God's blessing you. We would know this theologically as, I just can't get too deep into this, okay? So I really want to. So the Jews really looked at Job then, and God had referred to Job as a blessed people. I wrote in my notes, it's a case study turning Jewish thought on its head. That when there's no rational, humane, or theological explanations for pain or disaster, then you got to trust God. And so when you have people that are really struggling with some major family issue, too often, we have a bit of a look like, well, I know them. I know how they parented. I know. If you knew what I knew, you'd know why their daughter is off the reservation right now. Yeah, if you knew what I knew about them, you'd know why that financial reversal is going down. I mean, obviously, they got this physical problem. Something's going on. Because we are built with the ability to reason And we always want to come up with explanations. So we're going to give our explanations, which is why in John 10, Jesus, why is this guy blind? Right? So let me turn with you to Job. Come with me to Job. Let me just water ski over this, okay? We're not going to scuba dive, but I think it'll help you. Because if for nothing else, understand, when you ask the question, who in the Bible needed the most comfort in an uncomfortable circumstance, which James, the New Testament first pastor at Jerusalem, and somebody mentioned about Job and patience, exactly right, because all of those that knew the Old Testament knew that Job, behold, we count them happy which endure, because you've heard of the patience of Job. The same term in verse 7. And you've seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. And James features God's pitiful mercy through the life of Job. And this is why in Job you find the basic principle, and it's good to help people know that are going through family difficulties, that Job was not picked out by God. He was picked out. He wasn't picked on. It's not like God said, boy, oh boy, here's Job, and he's got problems. I'm going to end up putting him through the ringer. The reality is that this is exactly where you end up finding Job at, where God, first of all, as I mentioned to you, he faced crisis. He was in the hands of Satan. Do you see it in chapter 1, verse 6? Now therefore was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them, and the Lord said to Satan, where are you coming from? And Satan answered the Lord, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him in the earth, a perfect, upright man, one that fears God, hates evil. And Job said, does Job fear God for nothing? You've got a hedge about him, verse 10. In verse 11, you put forth your hand now and you touch all that he has, and he'll curse you with your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power, on him in himself, but don't forth on your hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. And this is where you find God allowing events to happen. And the rest of chapter 1 and into chapter 2, you know that Job, who never realized that there were heavenly matters with God he knew nothing about, yet deeply affected his life. And I think it's always a good thing to be reminded that this is exactly where often we are so limited in our perspective. And you say, well, that's back in the day of Job. But the reality is, when you look at this and you overlap it with today as you read the New Testament, isn't much different when every one of those churches in Rome and Philippi, the letters to Romans and Philippians and Galatians and Ephesians, and then Paul's own dealings with Timothy and Titus, and on into the writer of Hebrew, that there was a constant struggle horizontally. And the reality is that there are bigger things going on, and we like to evaluate. Let me say it again. And this is why the book of Job is given to the Jews, to help them know that he's breaking the mold of what you think and how you think. So how do we help others? Number one, help them understand that as God put them in the hands of Satan, which, by the way, he did, as I mentioned to you, he did end up facing bankruptcy, bereavement, and boils. That's a good way to overview that. He said, have you considered my servant Job? Years ago, I heard a message, would God tell Satan to consider you for trials to glorify him? Is Satan leaving you alone because you're no threat to him? And the proposition is, when we are feeling picked on, remind yourself of God picking you out for his glory. And know that when he lost his fortune, he lost his children who he offered so much for, he lost his health, and they don't know what that incurable disease was, whether particular ailments, but we do know the full body, punishment of itching, emptying, oozing, boils with bad breath, and facial disfigurement and inflamed body parts and smallpox. They don't know whether it was chronic eczema, halitosis, elephantitis, acute melanoma, over all of that. But that's Job. And he finds himself now sitting on the dump heap. In chapter 2, when you end up finding the conclusion after God did let all this happen, that verse 7 of chapter 2, so went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, smote him with boils. And verse 9, then said his wife unto him, do you still retain your integrity? Curse God and die. In all this, it says, then to verse 10, that this did not Job sin with his lips. I personally think that his wife knew he was such a godly man that she said, I know the only way that Job will ever fail is if she would just curse God, because he's not going to do it. If you just do it, he'd kill you, because I don't like seeing you in all this misery. That's a step away from pulpit. That's my view. I'm not sure she had such a bad attitude as much as just, I love my husband, I don't want to keep going through this. And so I put this into the mix because I think what you got to realize, first he faced crisis, and then he went on to face his criticism. This is where you pick it up in chapter 3, and really almost the rest of the book. And there's no phrasing that God put him in the hands of men, but you read the rest of this whole poetic literature, you find him in chapter 3, verse 1. And after this opened Job his mouth, he cursed his day, and Job spake, and then he went on to say, let the day perish when I was born. And he goes on to give this whole gut-wrenching sense about what was happening in all of this. And eventually you end up finding a phrase in chapter 3, verse 25, the thing which I greatly feared, he said, has come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come upon me. Years ago, Bob Wood, he preached a message on this, and he said his premise was that the very things that Job feared were the very things that came on him. That was the proposition, the whole rest of his message. And it's worth consideration to understand that often the very things you fear, that's sometimes the very thing that comes on you. My application, quite frankly, would be when you think about the things that you fear the most, and by the way, for most of you ladies, that is a huge challenge for you. And it's easy because out of your fears, you want to be able to tell your husband, and often your husbands who love you enough, and so you got to be careful to be able to say, hey, I'm going to tell you what I'm fearing. Now, I'm not telling you need to do this, but, and so I think there's this relationship together. For some of you as teenagers, understand that the things you fear the most, often those are the things that come on you. And so I'm suggesting to you that in the midst of this is not just some kind of intrusion. We're talking about major disasters and catastrophes, that it's fair enough to say, okay, God, this is a crisis. I mean, God, you love me enough to put me in this crisis? Now, I'm not saying that Satan is doing all of this, but he has a short leash. But there's that component, possibly. But then in addition to that, he's now facing this criticism. He's put in the hands of men. And my suggestion would be that Job's best comfort was not receiving explanations for his suffering. He needed assurances of God's presence. If you want to say it another way, explanations help the mind, revelation calm the spirit. And so if you're counseling people and working through major crisis situations, they don't need an explanation. They actually need you to be saying, God, I want to be able to help and point them back to the very revelation of God's word, because this is what's going to bring the most comfort to help them with all of that. So in the time remaining, and I hope I don't frustrate you. If you'd like a copy of all this, I can give it to you, but we don't have to go through the painful comforters, and I'm summarizing, but you end up finding Eliphaz, who was the rationalist that reasoned with Job, and he tried to work through all this with Job, and that didn't work. He based all of his words on experience. It's like, hey, I know, so let me, I've been through this, so let me help you through this, Job, because all came back to Job. You actually are a sinner, and obviously all this came down on you because of who you really are. Then you end up having Bildad who shows up, and he's the apologist that sought to defend God, and he based all of his words on tradition, because traditions obviously teach us that when you have this kind of bad disaster and crisis, then obviously there's things that you're hiding. And again, I'm giving you the aggregate of Zophar, who, as the great comforter, was the attorney that set up a case against Job, and there was no way Job was going to win this. And he based his words on assumptions, all of them assumptions that were faulty. And then finally, you end up having the youngest show up in Elihu, and he was the youngest counselor, but he also thought that he had all the answers. And in the midst of all of this, quite frankly, you find Job now, who did better with his crisis and all of the pain and loss, and he's looking at him being in almost code blue condition. He's looking at 10 tombstones out his window, and he has nothing left. His own family aren't even around. And then Elihu, who's like, he's the youngest guy, starts in real mild, but eventually he's like, actually, I really got the answers. And he tries to posit this is the reason why. I don't know if you ever had somebody younger than you come in and tell you your problems. Because the wisest counselors I've ever heard about counseling teenagers are those that don't have them. But I do find that you end up realizing that Job actually, when he faced conviction, because he felt like, according to Job, I think it's 19:21, where he said, I am now put into the hand of God. And he was changed when he moved from hearing practically to seeing God personally. And it's amazing to me when out of the 84 or so questions, the final exam, and Job has no answers, as you would read, like chapter 38 on, that he has no answers for all of creation and the creatures, that Job finally answers in chapter 42. This will close. The Lord said, I know that you can do everything. No thought can be withholden from you. Who is he that hides counsel without knowledge? I've uttered that I understand not. Things too wonderful for me. I don't know. Here I beseech thee, I'll speak. I'll demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. I've heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, and now mine eye hath seen thee. And I abhor myself for pen and dust and ashes. And he comes a point of total brokenness and surrender. Like, God, I give up. And at that particular point, you end up finding God now taking care of the counselors first. And it's interesting to notice, and it was so noticed for those of you that are counseling and helping families, that after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz, my wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends. You've not spoken of me the thing that is right as my servant Job. Now don't miss this. Verse 8, therefore take unto you now 7 bullocks, 7 rams, go to your servant Job, offer up yourselves a burnt offering. My servant Job will pray for you, and I'll accept it, lest I deal with you after your folly, and that you've not spoken of me. Notice the thing which is right, like my servant Job. And you know what made God mad? When counselors misrepresent who God is and how He's working and His character. You be very careful. Are you sure you're representing God in this counsel to these people? And they misrepresented who God was. And when all of that finally takes place, notice verse 10, when the Lord turned the captivity of Job, when did this captivity, literally it's the term for prison, when did God release Job from this prison? For 6 months. And that's when he prayed for his friends, verse 10. Then the Lord gave Job twice as much. And the pattern is always a release that comes, and then restitution, and then a reward. And it always starts with this thing called repentance. And when all that happened, verse 11, notice, there came unto him where did all of his brothers and his sisters go in all this? But now his family's showing up, and all they had been, and his acquaintances, and everybody's showing up. Why? Because now Job's coming out of this funk and this huge catastrophe. He didn't eat bread, and they comforted him. And then the evil that the Lord had brought upon him, and all of them brought, and they gave him a piece of gold. They invested back into him, and every one of the earring of gold. If you have family troubles, and you hang with your family, the last thing they need is you to go away. And when God brings people through major difficulties, that's when you need to show up. My wife is like the platinum level of this. I'm thankful for it. This is why many of you love great preaching. For years out in Guam, I tell people, listen, you come Sunday morning, and I'm going to do the best I can. I'm chicken and rice. But I bring in people that are like steak because I want you to hear these guys preaching. You can get amazing preaching on the web. I listen to preacher every morning when I shower, and I love it. These guys are amazing. Some of them I would never really want in my church or the church I was pastoring, but I'm okay because some of the things they said is like, this is amazing. But I'm going to promise you, those guys are not going to show up at the hospital. Pastor Shaw is going to show up. His staff's going to show up. That's who's going to be there to help you. That's why this church is important. And when you understand that, lastly, in the last 2 minutes, here you go. Here's my take-home truths. Number one, how do you help people? Give love, not advice. Let's take advice from the greatest comforter of all, the Holy Spirit. You don't need to explain comfort. You don't need to explain all the crisis. I like what Barbara Roberts in a book, Helping Those Who Hurt, said. Don't judge, condemn, or blame. Don't use cliches like, well, isn't it a blessing that he's no longer suffering? Look at the bright side. Don't encourage a person to think about something else. Don't think that it's your job to eliminate another's pain. Back in 1653, a guy named Thomas Case wrote a counseling book when Christians suffer. He said, quote, the first lesson God teaches us about affliction, particularly in a family, is to have compassion for those who are in a suffering condition. We're prone to be insensitive when we're at ease in Zion, partly out of the delicacy of self-love, which makes us unwilling to sour our own sweet blessing with the bitter taste of strangers' affliction. And upon this very account, God brings a variety of afflictions and sorrows upon his own children, unquote. So the reality is, give love, not advice. Number 2 out of 3, give support, not correction. This is the picture and pattern of the Holy Spirit himself, the Spirit of truth. The world can't receive because they don't see him. He said, I'll never leave you comfortless. I'll come to you. Hard is hard. And there are things in life, and your family might be going through a hard thing right now. Hard is hard. Hard is not impossible. Hard is not bad. Hard is hard. And you either become a ministry or you have a new ministry when you're going through hard things in ministry. Psalms 3, lamenting is a process, and it doesn't eliminate pain, but it gives a purpose. So you trust and you adjust. And lastly, my advice would be you learn to give sympathy, not a sermon. How many of you have been through difficulties and people here at the church have stepped up and they've given you sympathy? As God himself, Jesus said, I'm touched by their infirmities. It's mention of Jesus. And rather than being tortured by your theology, say, God, you know what's going on, and you're well aware. And so in the midst of this, there are God using oftentimes disasters and difficulties to get you to the place of saying, God, I want to see you more clearly. None of us have ever going to be a Job-like experience. There are individual things that say, boy, I feel like Job. But you have opportunities as a church body. Some of you have no family that know the Lord. The only family that know the Lord are the ones you know here. This is what makes a church a tight-knit church. This is what puts you in a place to say, this is where I need to be. And when you find yourself in that place, then this is where God said, I will bless you, but I use broken things. The church is not a club. It's a lighthouse. Your church isn't a club. It's a hospital for hurting people. And as the pastoral staff and you come around and help them and get them through these difficulties, then that's what brings you a tight-knit group. And I hope and pray that this can be of help to you. I hope tonight you'll come back because we are going to take a look at Philippians chapter 4. I think it'll be of help to you. I'm going to give you the number one event that draws close-knit families together. 1,000 close-knit families were asked, what do you do to keep your family tight? And I'll let you know.